One Piece is a topic that I've only dabbled with a bit on this channel so far, but now that we've gotten a trailer for the live-action Netflix series, which I'm cautiously optimistic about because at least from a visual standpoint, I think it's looking really cool, I figured that made for a great excuse to finally take another crack at a full One Piece video, this time turning some of the characters into demons. So I asked my subscribers, who know One Piece a lot better than I do, what devil fruit users could be cool for me to redesign and rewrite, fitting them into the world of my demon episodes, and y'all came through with a lot of really great suggestions, so thank you for those. And let's give some of them a shot. Let's go.
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
Until recently, I believed that attempts by the creator of demons, Fear herself, to turn humans into these vicious entities was only something she'd attempted in the last few decades. I now know that her trials in this territory date at least as far back as the late 1600s. This was the time in which pirates roamed the seas in most abundance, and it's said that the Polynesian island on which Fear herself was born was raided and pillaged by a troop of seafaring bandits, and when she discovered this, she set a curse upon the seas. As a being with a strong resonance with the darkest emotions and energies of humanity, Fear channeled that darkness into physical forms, which were eventually called the demon fruits. They were scattered across various islands of the seas, where the cruelest pirate captains were often drawn directly to the location of a demon fruit, feeling a sense of unity with the grim nature of them. One man drawn to such a fruit was a pirate warlord often referred to simply as Sir Crocodile. He was an arrogant, power-obsessed, and sadistic man who wanted, at a time, to become the mightiest pirate on the seas, and had managed to lead a whole syndicate of ships. But that was still not enough for him. He wanted to be world-renowned for his feats of power, but it seemed he was always in the shadow of another pirate, one who'd bested him in a duel years before, leaving his face scarred. This made him all the more susceptible to the lust for the demon fruit, and when he found it, drawn by a yearning for power that guided his mind, the fruit in his hand seemed to send a chilling promise across his being that his body would become an incredibly powerful weapon if he simply consumed the strange cactus-like fruit. And that was indeed true, but not in the way he hoped. His body indeed transformed, but he lost all control. The fruit blocked his soul's ability to have any power over his actions and elevated the most negative aspects of his ego, as he transformed into a demon with a crocodilian face and with the power to change into and control sand. The demon, thereafter called Crocosuna, slaughtered his own crew. It's said that he'd slowly fill the bodies of his victims with sand until they were nearly unconscious, then would have grainy blades spring from within them to finish them off. Regardless of what manner of tortures he used, though, when he was done with his crew, he fled from the very seas he once wished to rule, finding its waters now repulsive and able to even weaken his sand-shifting form. It's said he retreated into a desert and gained further power, as he'd so sought, in the sandy terrain. He used his might to torment and slay any humans he came across. That is, until he was tracked down by another demon, one who was not so easily manipulated by his own demon fruit. Now, I did heavily consider having this episode be one longer story like with my Ben 10 Demons episode, but I think I just don't know One Piece quite well enough to pull that off. I know Ben 10 a lot better than I know One Piece. I mean, I've watched a bunch of One Piece episodes, but a bunch is basically nothing considering there's like over 1,000 episodes. So I figured I'd keep the lore a little bit more broad like I did with a lot of the earlier Demon episodes. And I knew I wanted to use Crocodile when I saw him suggested a bunch. I didn't know who the character was before people suggested him, but when I got to looking into him, admittedly I thought he was going to have some crocodilian appearances, but he didn't really, but that's okay because I, could work it into the demon form anyway. But when I saw that he had the same kinds of powers as Sandman from Spider-Man, who I worked with recently too, and who I love working with any character with any kind of amorphous, shifting form, I was like, oh yeah, I got some ideas for this one that I think are going to be fun. And instead of pulling a lot of inspiration from Doom Eternal demons, as I often do, I was actually pulling more inspiration from concept art from the Darksiders series, specifically Darksiders Genesis, which I don't know if Joe Madureira, the comic book artist, was doing the concept art for the later games, but I know he was the one that did concept art for the earliest games, and I absolutely love his art style, and he's actually heavily inspired by anime, so, you know, that kind of works well for this. Another demon from this time was one who had worked alongside Sir Crocodile prior to him becoming a demon. Her name was Nico Robin, and she was raised on a small island called Ohara, and had been very well read for living in such an isolated location. Her community put heavy emphasis on research, elevating their collective knowledge. By the time she was a young adult, she was even able to read and speak a few dozen languages, and that made her a very valuable asset. When Sir Crocodile's crew passed through her territory, she wound up joining them, and eventually becoming his right hand. Though she hadn't intended to stay with him for long. Before she could leave his crew, though, the incident with his demon fruit occurred. Luckily, she had been on another ship in his syndicate when he'd gained his demon form, but she'd heard tales from one of the few survivors of the immense power he'd gained from consuming the fruit, and she became intrigued herself. The last of the few times she'd visited her home of Ohara, they had been studying a fruit that had washed up on their shores that sounded very similar to what had been said to have been consumed by Sir Crocodile. She returned home to see if her people were indeed researching another version of these demonic fruits, finding that it was indeed the case. Now, Robin was not said to have been a particularly vile pirate. On the contrary, she only sailed with pirates to sate her own curiosities as she traveled the seas, so it's possible she was not as inherently drawn to the fruit as other, more menacing seafarers were. But it may have been her immense curiosity which drove her to try eating the fruit herself. Sadly, she too transformed as her prior captain had. She grew horns and a tail with a blackened hand at its end. Hands and limbs would spawn and swirl around her body. She became able to have limbs spring from her many times over, and even have them grow from the environment around her. With a target in sight, she could even spawn one or more arms out from within her prey's body to have those arms strangle the person. Her poor home island became her first target for torment, and by the time she was done with her rampage of it, she burned the entire place to the ground, granting her the name of the Demon of Ohara, though others would know her by the name Honeycomb. She did not retreat from the seas as Crocodile had, but instead set off in search of other pirate crews to torment, likely driven by the underlying desires of the creator of demons. But beneath it all, while she had no control, part of her being was still trying to cry out, "I want to live," and unlike Crocodile, she would eventually get a chance. Now, Nico Robin was a character that once I saw some of the stuff that's happened with her recently, I was like, oh, well, this is a really great choice. Also, just the fact that people pointed out that her powers are to have like extra arms and hands and limbs kind of spawning out from her, and that could provide some really creepy, gross, weird design ideas. And overall, I like what I did with it enough. Like, I have a whole bunch of hands spawning out of this thing, and some of them just grabbing different parts of her, and I think that looks kind of cool, but I also feel like I could have pushed that even farther. Like, just have her entire body be a swirling mass of hands, and maybe that would have taken way too long, but you know, I feel like I kind of nerfed it a little bit in this design in terms of what I could have done with this. Not totally trying to bash it, I still like it overall, I like the colors of it, but I do feel like I went a little bit too humanoid with kind of all the demons in this episode. I do like a bunch of these designs, but with demon episodes, I've mentioned this before, I try to have not all of them just be a humanoid kind of shape. Some of them branching out into weirder kinds of shapes and bodies and things. Still, I like this one enough. You know, I look at it and it does look like a demon to me, though I don't think it quite stacks up compared to some of the other ones we've got in this episode. Still, I really liked working with Nico Robin, so thank you to everyone who suggested her. The reason Fear has likely not made attempts to use these fruits since this time is because it was proven unreliable. Like in her recent attempts to turn humans into demons just at the point of their death, it was eventually proven that some souls were able to regain control over their bodies and stop themselves from doing Fear's bidding. The being that proved this back in the days of pirates was a boy named Monkey D Luffy. He'd only come across a demon fruit as a band of pirates came through his town carrying one as cargo. Their captain had heard tales of the powerful yet devastating effects of these fruits, so he'd not permitted any of his crew to take even the slightest bite. They'd simply carry it with them in a chest, though they'd occasionally bring it out and showboat it around when they'd get a little too careless after a few drinks, like the night they came through Luffy's town. Luffy was just a child at the time and was hungry as the fruit was being tossed around, so he snatched it and he ate it, spawning great panic from the crew. They immediately rushed him out towards the seas as his body began warping and transforming. They'd heard rumors that the soul of the seas despised these fruits and would not permit those transformed by them to swim in its waters, so they tossed the boy into a dinghy and shoved him off. They watched as he floated offshore and finished his transformation. But he wasn't stuck in the waters for long. His demon form made his limbs able to stretch incredible distances, and he simply reached a 100-foot-long leg back to shore and stepped onto land. All the pirates had their weapons ready and drawn and pointed, but he didn't attack. Initially, he hadn't even gone through a dramatic transformation. He was taller and slightly more muscular and had demonic orange and black skin, but because he was a mere 7 years old, he did not have enough cynicism or fear or cruelty burned into his ego by life for the demon fruit to draw on and overtake his body fully. Because of the demon form, he would be far more prone to violence and anger, but unlike Crocosuna and Honeycomb, Luffy did largely manage to maintain control over his body. This made Luffy what in those times would be referred to as an awakened demon. Many would be afraid of him in his town, but he didn't care much. He was too enthralled by his own abilities. He trained with them and eventually even found that he could shift into different gears of his own power, becoming stronger and bigger and more fierce of a fighter. Eventually, he heard more and more stories of other pirates who'd been overtaken by the demon fruits and had slaughtered dozens if not hundreds with their powers. Luffy then deemed that, as an awakened demon with control over his might, it was his duty to set off to the seas and hunt down the other demon pirates, and either aid them in awakening to have control once more, or defeat them. In some cases, he'd be successful, such as with Nico Robin, who would take back control of her demon form and travel with Luffy for some time. But with the likes of Crocosuna, he'd have no such luck. Though eventually he'd have to come face to face with one of the fiercest demons on the seas, one who was near literally the embodiment of darkness itself. Now, I really like how this drawing turned out because I knew it was going to be fun to have it be a little bit of a blend of like a demon and a superhero, because this is a demon that has maintained control of itself and it's obviously doing more positive things than most of the demons I design usually do. And I don't remember when I talked about this. It might have been in a design notes episode on the PopCross Studios Patreon, but with demon episodes, a lot of the time I try to not give them like super dynamic poses, because I think with demons, to make them creepier, it's almost a better fit to have them kind of lurking about or staring at you from a distance kind of thing, like not so much a leaping at us and attacking kind of pose. But I also really loved how my Bakugo demon turned out in the My Hero Academia Demons episode, which you might want to check out after this if you're enjoying this episode. And it didn't quite feel demon-y in terms of that pose, but with this one I was like, okay, this is a case where it makes sense to lean into that a little bit more, because this character kind of is bordering on, demon superhero kind of territory. I pulled inspiration from a whole bunch of different images of Luffy in his Gear 4 state and from his Sun God Gear 5 state. And I think I found a nice blend of all the different kinds of influences that I was taking, and even if he doesn't have his straw hat, I hope you all like the result. I earlier mentioned a pirate more revered than any other, the one who'd given Sir Crocodile his scar. This man was known by many as Whitebeard, and his crew was feared by any who set forth onto the seas. But he is not the next demon we'll speak of. It was instead a member of his crew, Marshall D. Teach. He'd been a member of the crew for nearly 2 decades and was practically like a son to Whitebeard. But when he'd heard about these demonic fruits, he'd developed a desperate yearning to possess one for himself. He felt it was his fate to acquire one. He didn't admit this to his fellow crewmates, however. Whitebeard openly dismissed these fruits as far too dangerous of a curse to be worth considering using in any capacity, and, in fact, claimed that if he ever came across one, he would destroy it. But Marshall wouldn't allow that to happen. While sailing through unfamiliar territory, Marshall gained an overwhelming urge to steer off towards a small distant island. It was beyond the sense of a voice simply calling to him, but more like a clawed hand tugging at his chest towards it. He convinced Whitebeard that the small island was a place worth investigating in case other crews had used the island as a supply drop point, so they made a go for it. Soon they got close and rowed to shore, where Marshall quickly found exactly what he was after, a large, spiky purple fruit that seemed to be radiating darkness. He immediately tried to take a bite, only to have one of his crewmates leap in to knock the fruit from his hands, recognizing exactly what it was. Marshall tried to grab the fruit again, but his crewmate grabbed it himself and did all he could to keep it away from Marshall. Marshall knew he couldn't hold them all off once they arrived, so, in a panic, he drew his musket and blew a hole right through the chest of one of his own. He snatched the fruit from the dying man and raised it to his mouth. Whitebeard saw this and told him that if he took even a single bite, they'd sail off and leave him behind. But Marshall had no qualms with that outcome, so long as he gained the power of the fruit. He could feel it calling to him from his hand and saw this as further proof that this was his fate. He took his first bite, and Whitebeard and his crew fled to their boats, rowing back to the ship. As they drifted away, Whitebeard watched from afar as a man he'd practically raised turned into a monstrous form with a long black beard and limbs that burned with black flames. It wouldn't be the last time the two would see each other, but before their next meeting, the demon, now called Black Yamino, would overtake another ship that came too close to the island he was trapped on. He'd kill their whole crew, and using demonic tendrils spawned from his back, would pilot the ship himself, hunting down other pirates, killing all their crew members but one, whom he'd capture and force to run his own vessel on threat of death. He'd do this over and over, and soon he'd have built up his own hostage crew. His name would spread, and encountering him would be considered a fate worse than death. But soon, there was a calling within Black Yamino again, beyond just hunting down pirates. It was like when the fruit had drawn him in, but this time it was a calling to hunt down someone in particular. The awakened demon, Mongo Moostraw, Monkey D Luffy himself. It was likely that fear was pushing him to do this, enraged that Luffy was turning and defeating her other demons, but regardless of the reason, Blackbeard set off on a hunt that would bring him to blows many times with Luffy, and would greatly challenge them both in terms of how far they could push their demonic might. Now, writing that story actually made me think I probably could have constructed a good single overarching narrative for this, and I guess I kind of did have that because these stories all do tie together, but I mean, like, I probably could have constructed, you know, a narrative with an actual character arc and stuff following one specific character, but again, I don't feel I know the timeline specifically of One Piece well enough to have pulled that off. Though, with all the suggestions I got for really cool Devil Fruit users that I could use, it did make me that much more interested in possibly doing more One Piece stuff. So if anyone has some really good suggestions for a good way to get into One Piece and learn a lot about it without watching all 1,000 episodes, like maybe some of the most important arcs or something like that, or some of the best ones, give me some suggestions in the comments, because I'm definitely open to that. But it will also depend, you know, how my audience in general responds to this video, if people like it. I think this one's a decent resume for, you know, possibly doing some more One Piece stuff, but, you know, I'll see what you all think. Anyway, I hope you all like the last design. Let's take a look.
Well, I would certainly say this is a fairly unique batch of demons. I mean, most of the demons I make are pretty unique. That's one of the things I like about this series. But let me know if you'd like another round of this, or other things I could do with Devil Fruit users, because there's so many cool ones that I hadn't even heard of that people suggested that would be fun to work with. Also, if you want the inks from this episode to color yourself, or access to early high-resolution art, or a bonus podcast series where I talk about my writing and design process more in depth, you might want to consider supporting me over on Patreon. Also, I only have one other full One Piece episode, which is kind of a funny one in retrospect now, where I turned One Piece characters into mythical gods. But I've also used Luffy a few different times in different anime-focused episodes, so if you're new here, you might want to go poking around and check some of those out. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the thought I want to leave people with is actually pretty fitting, given that this was a demon episode, because I think it's very useful to visualize hatred as a demon. One that's made up of all the collective hatred felt by humanity. And the more we hate, the bigger it gets and the worse life is for everyone on Earth. But the kicker about this demon is, it does not care at all how justified you feel in your hatred for someone else. So if it wants to draw hatred out of a dog lover, it'll put into their awareness a person who drowns puppies for the sadistic pleasure of it. And obviously actions should be taken to stop that person from doing what they're doing, but the way you beat the demon is by taking those actions not out of hatred for that person, but out of love for the puppies that you're trying to save. And even going into it with compassion for that person, knowing that any of us, if we were born in their mind and body and to their parents and their life circumstances, it's very likely that we would be acting the exact same way. Part of my personal philosophy now is that I love everyone unconditionally, no matter how much I dislike some of the things they do. Not saying everybody has to do that, but I think it does make life a lot more peaceful. I hope that's inspiring, I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.